better the better the question is, the better the answer can be. The reason I gave this very kind of provocative title to the talk, Troublemaker, the misidentification of our kids, is because a couple of years ago, I was speaking at the annual conference for the Association of Psychologists here in Toronto, here in Canada, and I gave a talk on ADHD. And after the talk, during the talk, I'd mentioned that, what is remarkable is that I went to primary school, secondary school, university in Nigeria, and nobody had ADHD. And then they all started laughing because they understood the joke. And I said to them, we never said anybody had ADHD. We just called them Oni Jongbo. And that's Yoruba for troublemaker. And I remember saying that, but it just never, I haven't given a talk about ADHD since, but I've given talks about other things. And so when Dr. Adigbite asked me to give this talk, I thought, oh yes, that would be an apt title because it's something that has come up in my conversations before. A little note about my meeting with Dr. Adigbite. We met in May at a conference, and I was super impressed with the work that herself and her colleagues are doing in Nigeria. It is, for lack of a better term, God's work. They're activists, they're advocates, they're extraordinary clinicians, and I'm proud to have had the opportunity to meet with them. I am grateful for the platform, and thank you for the work you do at CanDo, as well as Bode, whom I understand is a telehealthcare platform. This is all important stuff that has to be done in Nigeria, and to be any part of it should be a thing of great pride. I thought that this was going to be a conversation with experts and clinicians, and I was happier to learn that there are going to be parents in the audience. So I tried to make things as simple as possible. And I have two faults. I tend to get into the weeds too much, and I tend to speak fast. I will try to slow down. I will try to stay above the fray and keep it relatively simple so that everyone can listen and understand, and if necessary, ask questions, because that's the real key thing here. So as tends to be the case when we have presentations like this, I have to declare any conflicts that I have. I have no conflicts of interest here. I'm not getting any compensation for being here. I do want to say that most of what I would reference will be relevant to what we call the DSM-5. The DSM is the equivalent of the kind of psychiatry Bible in North America. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It is a book that we use to define what we consider a condition that warrants a diagnosis. It lists what we call the criteria, the things that need to be seen for us to say this person has this diagnosis. The reason it's called the DSM-5 is that over the years, it has gone through revisions. And so the DSM-5 in its current iteration was published in 2013. And so we've had a number of things that have happened since before then, and it's kind of evolved over time. So you'll hear me make a lot of references to DSM-5, and that's the reason, because it's basically how we communicate. But I will still try to keep it simple, and if there are any questions, please feel free to bring them up at the end of the talk. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and neurodevelopmental disorders are conditions that tend to be, first of all, manifested early in childhood and can affect the child's brain in a way that would express itself either in terms of changes in their behavior, their ability to think about certain things, their ability to communicate, and these can have, in some instances, lifelong impacts. So we identify them early. We tend to have some understanding of them. But in 2013, when the DSM-5 was developed, ADHD and these other conditions were put under the umbrella of neurodevelopmental disorders. So intellectual disability, or what we used to call mental retardation, is a neurodevelopmental disorder. Autism spectrum disorder, which I suspect many in the audience are familiar with, is a neurodevelopmental disorder. Specific learning disability is the inability to kind of read and understand words. Or dyscalculia, the inability to kind of understand numbers and the context in which they work together Those are neurodevelopmental disorders. Tics is a motor disorder that's also a neurodevelopmental disorder, as communication disorders, even stammering, what is here referred to as stuttering, it is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So there's a large spectrum of neurodevelopmental disorders, of which ADHD is one. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder has also gone through several name changes. We've known about this condition for about 100 years. However, initially it was just, this kid who just had a lot of energy. And then in the early iterations of the DSM, it was called hyperkinetic disorder. Hyperkinetic disorder is, hyper, a lot, kinesis, movement, a lot of movement. So that's how it was understood, to be primarily a lot of movement in these young people. And over time, with the newer versions of the DSM, we started to call it ADD and ADHD. People in the audience might know ADD versus ADHD. And the understanding or the driver behind that was that there were some kids who had essentially the same, impairments, the same limitations, but who didn't present with a lot of hyperactivity. So it was considered attention deficit disorder. And then there was this other group of people who had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So for a while, there was that distinction between the both of them. In the DSM-4, they were grouped together as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but we now call it types, subtypes. And so the subtype was attention deficit hyperactivity disorder inattentive subtype, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder hyperactive impulsive subtype. What is true, though, is that we all have sometimes periods where we're distracted. So it was less about one having a categorical type and more about which symptoms were more prominent. And so we moved from calling it a type to saying this is a presentation, essentially to suggest that the people who have ADHD inattentive subtype may have had some hyperactivity, but somehow have not so much overcome it, but it is not a presenting primary problem. And then for many people who have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, who are hyperactive and impulsive, they also have elements of inattention, but the primary driver for their behaviors is a hyperactive, impulsive presentation. So we don't use types anymore, we now use presentations. And that has been in place for a number of years now. And I think it's important to just understand, we've known that this condition exists for a very long time. We've studied it for a very long time. The language, the nosology is what has evolved, not the condition. And kind of going back to the issue around the separation, what most people present with is the combined presentation. So they have a lot of hyperactivity and they have a lot of inattention. And so we think about between 50 and 75% of presentations are the combined subtype. We see the next level being the inattentive presentation. The inattentive presentation, again, probably about 20 to 35%. The thing here is that this is an interesting population because it's more common in girls, and we tend to see it later. And we see it later because the kids aren't problematic. They just kind of get along. They're like, oh, she's just quiet, not a troublemaker. She's smart, but she's never present. She's in la la land. And what tends to be the case is when the burden of academic demands gets higher, they start to do less well academically, even though they're intelligent. You just see that the grades start to drop. So that's the inattentive presentation. And we see that about a third of the time, where it's predominantly inattentive symptoms that they're presenting with. The kids who present with the predominantly hyperactive impulsive type are mostly male, and it's a small population of them that don't have an attention as a present symptom. So the hyperactivity and the impulsivity tends to be what is the driver. That is what most people see. And so it's important to just at the back of our minds understand that these are kind of a spectrum illness, but we see particular sets of symptoms much more prominent, and that's the presentation. Again, boys are 2 to 3 times more likely to have this condition than girls. And there are many reasons why this could be. There's many postulates, but again, we tend to see the hyperactive, impulsive, boisterous troublemaker as the one who gets diagnosed more readily. The girls tend not to be diagnosed as early. And there are some studies actually that suggest that they're at par at a certain age, although, I mean, I think we probably need to do a little more research just to be sure that what we're seeing is not an anomaly or an inaccurate interpretation of the data. Okay, so what is it? What is it? This is a highly genetic trait, highly heritable. If a parent has ADHD, the child has a 30% chance higher than somebody whose parent doesn't have ADHD. So you're going to have, and I'll tell a short story here. One of my friends visited with me. It's been a couple of years now, and he was sharing his story about ADHD and how his kids have ADHD, they're getting treated, they're fine now, he's happy. And he had this conversation with me because I'm a child psychiatrist, so he felt he could share with me. And I remember the guy from high school, and he was considered a troublemaker. In fact, that was his nickname. And so I felt like, oh my goodness, all of that time he was struggling and he was mislabeled and he had a lot of consequences. And now he's grown, he's a successful business person, and he's come to identify what was going on, and now he's got his kids getting treated, but it spoke to the heritability of this trait. So about 30% chance higher if your parent has ADHD. If you have a sibling with ADHD or a fraternal twin, it's higher. It's 70% chance that you're going to have ADHD with a sibling with ADHD. Parents with multiple kids. Just in clinic yesterday, I had a parent I was just going over, okay, here's what happens with the medicines, here's what you have to look out for. And she said, Doc, never mind. My other son has ADHD. I've been through this. Let's save some time. So highly heritable amongst siblings. If your twin is 90%, if you have a twin with ADHD, I am going to put money on the fact that the other twin is going to have ADHD if they're identical twins. So a 90% concordance rate. There is this data that we talk about in psychiatry that 70% of mental health struggles in adulthood started in childhood. And so likewise, when you have ADHD, these are symptoms that tend to persist into adulthood. We'll talk a little bit more about just what that could look like shortly. But these symptoms tend to persist into adulthood, and they can be quite debilitating. And we'll speak about that in a minute. They have an impact on your academic life. They have an impact on your social life and on your occupational functioning. It can be quite a burden to have this condition. And worse still, if you don't know what it is and you're simply going through life being measured against people who don't have the condition and who don't appreciate the struggles. This is an interesting stat that I think is important to delve into this a little bit. This is a global statistic, right? And so part of this is there are places where these conditions are identified better, earlier, and interventions are put in place. And then there are some places, parts of the world where it's not identified, it is not labeled, adequate study isn't, adequate funds are not put into place to understand it. So this number is skewed based on that fact. So I don't want us to look at these numbers and think this is the prevalence, the global prevalence that is truly reflective of it across the world. There are varying factors that impact how quickly these things can be identified and interventions put in place. And I'll share another slide that kind of elaborates that. The adult data is interesting because, and I'll use an anecdote to explain what I'm trying to say here. If you're a 10-year-old and I ask you to sit in a classroom for 3 hours and listen to my lecture, and you have ADHD, that is going to be the worst kind of hell you can imagine, because 3 hours is like forever. There you go. If you're in university, say your third year of university, and I ask you to sit in a classroom for 3 hours, the likelihood is that you can tolerate that, even if you have ADHD, because for you, the consequences are greater. So I suspect that to some extent, there is this element of being able to suppress some of those symptoms. And I will say this, on at least 3 occasions, I've had children who I was treating and providing some education for, who came for follow-up in 3 months. And when they came back, their dad was like, or their mom was like, oh, doc, you know what? When you were talking about little Johnny, those symptoms resonated with me. And I went to my doctor and now I've been diagnosed. So that's somebody that was not captured by this data. So I think it's important to interpret this data and put it into context. So I think somebody had put up a stat about 3 to 6% in the UK. Yes, that's about what we have globally, and this is important because as you look at this, you have to wonder: does this mean that it's overreported in North America or underreported in Africa, or is it just a true reflection? Is a truth somewhere in the middle? I think all of those things could be argued effectively. The reality is that there is some variability, but nowhere do we have it less than 3%. So we think that it's existing. However, I want to remind everyone, the level of scrutiny, the capacity to make the diagnosis, all of that varies between countries. And I want us to look at, especially at the Africa data that suggests it's about a 3% prevalence rate, and the Asia data. There might be factors there that skew the data. In North America, we have Mexico, Canada, United States. In Africa, there are 54 countries. So I think that there's important, there's value in interpreting this data and putting it into context. So in Nigeria, the data that I saw, I think there was a 2010 study that had a 5 to 7% prevalence rate. You can see that these 3 countries, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, perhaps compared to some other countries, may have a more robust academic environment where there is an incentive for people to go do studies, to do some research, and perhaps maybe not the most sophisticated infrastructure for research, but enough that we feel like we can rely on some of that data. And there are enough people doing the work, and there is enough support for that kind of research. Because I was able to see data from these particular countries that was more perhaps reliable than most of what I was seeing, where it was determined to be 1% in some countries, and I wasn't sure about how the data was accumulated. But the point is, you're seeing some similarity. And although these countries are very different in terms of how they're governed and what obtains there and the population, for the most part, this reflects probably these are the ones that are skewing the numbers higher and having the ones that are reporting 1%, 2%, and we're sitting at like a 3 point something percent in Africa as a whole. So how do we make the diagnosis? And I think this is important because there are parents in the room. I often get asked by parents, do a test. And when they say do a test, I think what the parents mean, and I think they come by this honestly, is if I have high blood pressure, you are going to check my blood pressure and it's going to give you a number above which I have high blood pressure. If I have diabetes, you're going to take my blood, send it to the lab, and I'm going to get a number that tells me I have diabetes. If I have a broken bone, you're going to send me to the x-ray room. I'm going to get an x-ray. I will see the crack in my bone. And so there is this sense that there should be a categorical test that says that you have ADHD. While the sentiment that drives that is a legitimate one, the reality is that the diagnosis of ADHD is a clinical diagnosis, which means we see these symptoms, we put kind of numbers to them, we just assign severity to them, and then we make a call that this is enough to meet the threshold of ADHD. Now, remember we talked about the DSM-5 Bible, as it were. There are some other tools that we use. They're called rating scales, and they vary. Different countries have different ones. The ones we use here, we use the Vanderbilt, we use something called a SNAP-4, we use the Connors, we have CBCL, we have a variety of them. And they, when you're asked questions, the parents will get asked questions, perhaps the teacher will get asked questions. Those questions are now kind of collated. We now say, wait a minute, you scored 3 on this, or you said these symptoms were very severe. It suggests ADHD. And I'll tell you another criterion when we get to the next slide. But these things are, behavioral observations. I have kids who walk into my room, and in 2 minutes, I'm like, why are we even doing rating scales? This is a clear, what we call in medicine, a spot diagnosis. You see it, it can't be anything else. And so we can do that. And when we feel like there might be other conditions going on, or the call is very kind of on the edge, we can do much more formal psychological testing, where you have licensed psychologists who do a battery of tests. They evaluate the person's intelligence, the person's working memory, a number of the elements of their functioning that would speak to ADHD and other co-occurring conditions. And so that tends to be like the gold standard, as it were. But you can make this diagnosis by simply asking a bunch of questions about the person's history, about the level of functioning, and about the level of impairment that they have as a result of their ADHD symptoms. So in the DSM-5, as I mentioned, we use it to rate these conditions, and we look for these symptoms, as it were. And the inattentive symptoms, if you have 6 or more of this as a child, failure to give attention to detail, failure sustaining attention, doesn't seem to listen, following through on instructions is very difficult for them, they're not organized, they just don't want to do anything that requires that they think through certain things. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because that's a very key element in ADHD. And they lose things. So I can't find my towel, I can't find my bag, I can't find my pencil case, I can't find. That tends to be the narrative that they present with. And you ask them to go get their, maybe get their homework from upstairs. They get upstairs, they see the PlayStation, like, that's so cool, I could just do that right now. And then they do that. And then you come upstairs and you're like, little Johnny, I just use little Johnny. Little Johnny, why didn't you just do what I asked you to do? Oh, I forgot. And it's, again, for parents, it's a struggle, because you're thinking, this is an intelligent young kid. The kid heard me. The kid is not challenging. What do they mean they forgot? But I told you many times. And when you start to hear that narrative, I think it's important to wonder what else could be going on. In terms of the hyperactive symptoms, about 6 or more in children is what we tend to use as a threshold for making the call. You'll see the kid not able to sit still, they're squirming, they're moving, like they have ants in their pants is the term that we use. They blurt out answers, they'll say things, and they'll apologize immediately afterwards because they didn't mean to say it. But the ability to kind of withhold and constrain themselves is really limited. And so they get into trouble. They talk a lot. They're blurting out answers prematurely, interrupting others. So imagine this in a classroom, because this is how they get the label. They're the kid who is not sitting still. They're the kid who the class captain is going to write their name down, because you know that they're talking. And so this is how it accumulates a series of events that leads to the diagnosis of ADHD, but the label of troublemaker. These symptoms need to occur outside of one setting. And here's the reason. If a child is functioning optimally in the school environment, but is very disorganized when at home, very forgetful when they're home, very challenging to manage when they're home, it is less likely to be ADHD, and perhaps there's something else going on. And the reverse is the case. If the child is just doing very well at home, gets their homework done when they're home, just follows the instructions, hangs out with friends, doing everything functionally at their age, but when they're outside at school, it just all bets are off. And they're not able to function, they're isolating themselves, they're getting into trouble all the time. You have to wonder whether there is an environmental factor at play versus the ADHD diagnosis. And so for us, it isn't simply the presence of symptoms, it is the presence of symptoms in 2 or more settings, and it's the presence of symptoms interfering with their social functioning, interfering with their academic functioning, and for people at work, interfering with their occupational functioning. not just this presence of symptoms, there has to be an associated level of impairment with it. And these things have to occur before the age of 12. It used to be before the age of 7, but we feel like, especially for girls who get to be identified later, it's important that we give enough room so that the ones who we missed before the age of 7 are identified by the time that they're 12. And this was another thing that was associated with the DSM-5 in 2013. Now, what are the challenges we have with diagnosing this in Nigeria? I grew up in Nigeria, right? I think that there was very limited familiarity with the condition, very limited familiarity. In fact, I am confident in saying that no one I knew used the term ADHD in my childhood, and that I can look back and I can just point to a few people, boom, 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 this person had ADHD. Check them now, they have ADHD. So there was limited familiarity, and it's not for lack of willingness to learn. I think we have, brilliant educators in Nigeria. I think you don't know what you don't know, and when you know, then you know. It's that simple. And another thing, which is a protective factor in Nigeria, is that our communal nature means that we absorb a lot. We absorb a lot of aberrant or unusual behaviors, and we normalize it, and we kind of bring people into the fold. And so our threshold for saying something is an illness is very high. And so we have a lot of explanations for it that allow us to normalize things that even on face value, we can tell that there's something going on, but we've normalized it because it's just in our nature as Africans, as Nigerians, as part of our community is to normalize a lot of things and to avoid that stigma of having an illness. Another thing, though, is this, like what I call the logistic burden of the diagnosis, right? I said we have to get forms filled out by the doctor, by the teacher, forms filled out by the parent, perhaps forms filled out by the child. Even here in Toronto, it's not easy to get all of those things collated together. We'll send a form to the teacher is busy, they'll get to it when they get to it. The parents often may have ADHD themselves, so they're not organized, they don't check their emails regularly. The child needs about 2 or 3 forms sent repeatedly before they can complete it. And this is in the best case scenario. So I think that burden of just the paperwork of getting it done and getting it formalized or getting a psychological test is a lot for most families. And so that probably adds to the delay in getting the diagnosis. And many of those tools that I talked about, the Vanderbilt, the CBCL, the Connors, the SNAP4, some of them are available online for free, but I think that, again, not everybody has equal access to all these resources. So I think that also contributes to the challenge with the diagnosis. The last thing here is the fact that we live in a country where there are a number of stressors, a number of major legitimate burdens that people have to carry. And so relative to the other burdens of other illnesses, this is considered trivial. And I say that very carefully. It isn't to suggest that this itself is trivial. I wouldn't be speaking here if it was trivial. It is that relative to other things that people are struggling with, they would consider this trivial. And so it makes the diagnosis challenging because they're like, when I'm dealing with this, you think I care about that? Okay, so they beat him a few times in school, but maybe his head will be correct. I've heard that language. So I think it's important that we think about those types of things as being part of the challenge to making this diagnosis. So I want to talk a little bit about the brain and ADHD. And I was going to do a video here, but I thought maybe I'll just elaborate. There are a few things that we are familiar with in terms of how the brain works. And they have led us to understand the brain of a person with ADHD. This default mode network is, if you can imagine your brain at rest, and we have some imaging studies that suggest that when your brain is at rest, there are actually areas of your brain that light up, right? Where there's activity because your brain is at rest. And they are probably responsible for keeping your brain at rest. Now, we find that in people with ADHD, these areas don't turn off as readily. So that's the default mode network. If you think of the default mode as the resting state. So the resting state persists in people with ADHD more so than people with a kind of what we call a neurotypical brain function. And so they tend to wonder, they tend to just kind of be zoned out because their brain is still in resting state. And so that's one of the things that we think goes on in the brain of somebody with ADHD, where they have a kind of persistent default mode network, and they're not able to kind of recalibrate and pay attention because there are other parts of the brain that light up when the default mode network goes down. And those parts of the brain are also impacted. And so those parts of the brain can affect working memory, planning, and decision making. So if they're not as active, people with ADHD tend to have struggles in these domains. And so the planning piece requires kind of long-term kind of strategic thinking. And many people with ADHD struggle with that, especially when it comes to rewards. They want short-term immediate rewards, and their capacity to tolerate the wait time between their action and a reward is impaired. So their reward systems are also impaired. And so you'll find that, you'll tell them, if you wait 10 minutes, this will happen, and they're not doing anything for 10 minutes, they're not going to be able to wait for 10 minutes. Cognitively, they know that if they wait for 10 minutes, they will get what they want. But it is difficult for them to withhold the impulse to act. And so they tend to want immediate rewards. And that is an important element in supporting people with ADHD, recognizing that they can't tolerate, don't worry, we're going to do this next week if you're good for the whole week. Not going to happen. In fact, if you give reward at the end of the day, you're just as likely to not have success. But if the rewards are immediate and the reinforcement is what we call it, is immediate, you're more likely to get those actions done the way they should be. And we feel that the dopamine system is implicated because many of the medicines that we use to treat ADHD affect the dopamine neurotransmitting system. And so that is the kind of hypothesis, or the idea that we have, that dopamine is implicated in ADHD. So these things are things that have been proven, that we know, but they're hypotheses in terms of how they might cause ADHD. But I think it's important to recognize that there is a growing body of evidence that we see what is happening specifically in the brain of people with ADHD. These are some of the myths that people have shared with me. They think sugar causes ADHD. It does not. It does not. Okay? If you leave here with anything today, sugar does not cause ADHD nor contribute to ADHD. There are other factors that could be associated with sugar, but it does not cause ADHD. Some parents will say that they've made some very careful dietary restrictions for their child. As a parent, of course, you have the prerogative to do what you think is in the best interest of your child. And if for you, restrictions in their diet, healthy, reasonable, safe restrictions in their diet is what works for you, absolutely. You are the expert of your child, and you believe that you know what's best for your child. However, sugar does not cause ADHD. And this sense that, it's because the kid lacks discipline, they just didn't train the child at home. To the anecdote that I shared about my friend, this is a successful businessman now who's raising his own children. At the time, I bet you any of the teachers would have said this person will be a failure because he was such a troublemaker. So I think this sense that the kids are either lazy or they're not disciplined misrepresents these children in a way that's almost, I wouldn't go as far as saying criminal, but it's so unfortunate, because these are people who are doing the very best that they can, given the limitations that their brain has given them. The fact that it's not real is refuted by the slide before this. We have brain studies, we have lots of kind of research that supports not just the presence of this condition, but the impairments in the brains of people with this condition. And I think lastly, the sense that it's just poor behavior is again unfortunate, because when you have worked with enough people with ADHD, when you have been around enough people with ADHD, you can see the struggle. And here's another little piece that is important, especially because there are adults in the room who have ADHD. They know their struggle. They know it. They know that they can't pay attention. But if you have lived through a space where nobody called it, you've normalized it and you've worked through it, or you found little tricks to let you get through it. But you know what's going on, and you know that you're working harder than the next person to achieve the same thing. However, when you haven't put a name to it, when you haven't addressed it, you're almost ashamed of it. And that is what a lot of people with ADHD struggle with. And so because of that, they get labeled troublemakers. They get, they're like, oh, leave him, boys will be boys. He just had 3 broken bones by the time he was 11, but that's okay. He's just a boy. He's active. He's got a lot of energy. I don't think the kid wants to have 3 broken bones before they're 11, right? And that's the challenge here when you have these misconceptions that lead to poor interventions. When you say the kid is behaving this way because he wasn't trained well at home, well, we're going to train him in the school, or we're going to train him in the community. Again, it misunderstands what's going on and mislabels this child and then kind of tracks this child, because what happens over time is that we become the identity that we're called. The only reason I answer to Bode Akintan is because people have called me Bode Akintan all my life. If they call me something else, I'll answer to something else. And so for many of these children, what we call them, the way we see them, can impact them for the rest of their life. So it's really, really important that we're mindful of these labels that we give to these kids, because it is ignorant of the issues that they're struggling with that have caused them to have these types of behavioral challenges. And if you are around anybody with ADHD, you'll see, if you go to their rooms or if you go to their homes, you'll see that they're struggling. They're struggling in areas of their life all over the place. It's difficult to watch them kind of get through life. And over time, as they get older, they might find some little tricks. They might be the one who, if you look at their calendar, it's got 200 things, but they have to put 200 things on their calendar because they will forget 199 things if they don't. And so it tends to look like this, like they're almost always in the middle of something, and then they're going on to the another thing. So it's a profound impact in many areas of their life. In schools, oh goodness, I have lived this because I have friends who struggled with it in school. They can't follow the lessons. They're in the classroom. They're trying to be good students, but it's just not happening. They get homeworks. The rubric is 5 steps you have to take. They take 3 and then they submit. They can't be organized. They get hyperactive, impulsive. They get into trouble at school. They tend to be that kid that the class captain, I don't know if they still have class captains in school anymore, but the class captain knows them. In fact, if the class captain is supposed to write names of noisemakers, even before they start writing, they write those people's names because they know that they're going to be noisemakers. Even before they start writing the list, they're guaranteed noisemakers, guaranteed to be on that list. So the painful part, though, is that the academic underperformance is heartbreaking. Because what happens is, this is an intelligent child who gets 55%, 60% academic grades when they have the intellectual capacity for 85 or 90%. And often they leave marks on the table. They don't complete the assignment on time. And so they get marks dinged from them. They don't put in the effort because they're distracted by something else. And it's really sad, because what happens, again, you become the name that you get called, is that this person starts to say, you know what? I thought I knew that concept. I thought I listened. I thought I got it. But when I did the test, I got a 55. So maybe I'm not that smart after all. And that becomes the narrative that they follow, because they start to think that even though they think that they're smart, the scores don't reflect it. And the scores are the only objective evidence of how smart they are. And so they start to question themselves, start to doubt themselves. Sometimes the children start to avoid school or start to avoid anything where they feel like they'll be judged, because they expect to fail. And that becomes a self-concept, that becomes a narrative. And that's dangerous, because we don't want that for our children. So I think it's really important that we recognize it does not impact their intelligence. It impacts their ability to express that intelligence. And so what we want to do is to try to give them an opportunity to express that intelligence. I remember a young girl, she was about 14, she was in ninth, she was just starting ninth grade. And I started it when she started ninth grade. When she came back in the second semester, she said to me, "Oh, I didn't know math was so easy." She had failed math up to that point. And so she calls the pill her smart pill. And I had to spend some time saying, no. You were always smart. You just were not given a platform to express how smart you were. So this pill did not make you smart. You were smart to begin with. The pill just enhanced your capacity to express how smart you are. In psychiatry, we have this kind of expression, which is how we consider diagnosis being the only diagnosis you're struggling with. That seems to be the exception. Many times you have other conditions going on, and we call those comorbidities in medicine. We just describe them as comorbidities. So it's like, I have this and I have this and this. So this and this are the comorbidities. ADHD tends to be one of those conditions where very often you have comorbidities. I already explained to you how somebody with ADHD can now develop anxiety about themselves, about their performance. They can start to have low self-esteem. It can express itself as depression. Or they try to avoid tasks and they become very defiant because they're like, I don't want to do that. But underlying that is a sense of being discovered to not be smart. So they don't want to do the test because they feel like if they do the test, then you'll know that they're not smart. And so we label this oppositional defiant disorder. Parents who have children with ADHD might have heard the term. Anxiety tends to be something that happens frequently. Depression tends to happen frequently. And for parents in the audience who have children with autism, it would not surprise me that you have kids who have a lot of hyperactivity and disruptive behavior that's kind of labeled as ADHD, and they have to be treated for ADHD. And in addition, intellectual disabilities, what they used to call mental retardation, is also another frequently cited comorbidity for ADHD. So I think it's important that if somebody has ADHD, that we don't say that's all they have. We have to rule out other potential conditions that may be contributing to this. So this is an important slide because I think it's important to kind of elaborate on this. Medicines manage symptoms of ADHD. You don't get cured of ADHD. No different than you don't get cured of high blood pressure, or get cured of diabetes, or get cured of many of these conditions. If you take your blood pressure pills, your blood pressure would come under control. If you do other things, healthy lifestyle, rest and sleep and all those things, you make it less likely that your blood pressure gets high, and so more likely that you don't need the medication. And it's the same for ADHD most of the time, well, many times. And so we want to make sure that we recognize the medicines control the symptoms of ADHD, but there are other factors, other things that you have to incorporate into your lifestyle to make those symptoms less prominent and less impactful. And so the term that we use, the kind of play term, is skills along with pills. You learn skills, scheduling, organizing yourself, sleeping well, eating healthy, and you take the pills so that you can manage the symptoms. And so that's kind of how we have to think about the treatment for ADHD. Another myth I want to dispel is this sense that, these medicines, some people abuse them and are addicted to them. It is true that there are people who abuse stimulant medicines. Yes. Fortunately, over the last decade or so, many of the pharmaceutical companies have come up with formulations, the way a pill can be released into your body that doesn't give you an immediate hit, as it were, and that can probably safely be dispensed without the risk of using in another, like we call it diversion. So you don't have the ability to take the pill and use it or sell it on the streets. People would always have ill intent, but I think we have to start from a place that we know that the proper use of these medications does not lead to addiction. And in fact, if you do not treat ADHD well, you are at a several-fold increased risk of having addiction issues. I think last time I saw the data was almost like a 10-fold increase risk of addiction issues if you do not treat ADHD properly. So it's one of those things where, like, are you kidding? The risk of addiction is low with the medications that we have. The risk of addiction is high with untreated ADHD. For me, I think, again, parents will make the best decisions in the interest of their child, but you have to weigh what is in the data, what we know for certain. And the common side effects, the impact on appetite, the impact on sleep, the impact on heart rate, all of those things can be relatively managed easily. We have ways of being creative around diet, creative around sleep, and managing many of these potential side effects that some people can have. But again, the risk of not treating ADHD is far greater, as far as we know it, than the risk of treating ADHD in medicine if your primary concern is addiction. So medications, there are a number of medicines. I know that there are parents in the room, so I don't want to kind of get into the weeds with medicines. That's a whole different lecture. I'm happy to come back for that one. But this is like the big medicines, the different categories, methylphenidates, dexamphetamine salts. Depending on which country you're in, they might be called different things. So Ritalin is the one that kind of universally used as a name, but Concerta is commonly used. I prescribe that quite often. Bifentin, I prescribe it often. Vyvanse, Adderall, Foquest. There's a lot of them. They are all called stimulants. The concerns we have about them are their impact on sleep. They can keep you awake if you take them later. So we encourage that you take them early in the day so that the effect can wear off. And they can affect your appetite. They tend to suppress your interest in eating. And so we have to watch that because we don't want you as a growing child to not gain weight appropriately. So we monitor that. And when the medication wears off in the evening, your appetite returns, we give you more food so that it can make up for the time that you didn't have lunch or maybe you didn't want to have breakfast. The non-stimulants, and parents tend to go to these options because they've heard all these bad things about stimulant medicines. I will leave you with this. While yes, atomoxetine can help with ADHD, clonidine can help with ADHD, there is this thing that we use in medicine called effect size as a reflection of how much we expect the medications to work. Now, this is a scientific concept. This is not a scientific forum, but I want to leave you with these numbers to give you a sense of why we prefer the stimulant medicines. If you take one as the absolute, one is what you're striving for. A stimulant is like 0.85, like 85% of that in terms of effect size. If you take atomoxetine is about like a 60. 0.60 in terms of its effect size, and clonidine perhaps about the same thing. So that's the difference in terms of their effect size. Again, I would elaborate on these numbers in a scientific forum, but I just want you to get a sense that yes, Strattera can be helpful. Yes, clonidine can be helpful. However, in terms of effect size, stimulants far above in terms of their capacity to impact the child's functioning. So parents ask me about this all the time. What can the classroom do? What can we do at home? In class, we can have the kids sit in front because they're less likely to be impacted or distracted by the other kids in the classroom, and they can focus. The teacher can redirect them from time to time. They'll break down the tasks. They get more time on tests if they need to. For some kids that have the hyperactive, impulsive type, we tell them to go take a walk, make sensory breaks, just go out for a 2-3 minute walk, come back, sit for 20 minutes, go out for a 2-3 minute walk, come back. These are things that you can do in classrooms. Teachers tend to be accommodating if they know. And if they're aware of the condition, you can have a conversation with them, and we'll talk about that in terms of what parents can do. But yes, there are things that you can do in a classroom that can help make the child's life easier. At home, and I think this is something that certainly can be practiced, is Having consistent schedules, you do this at this time every day. For people with ADHD, that is a godsend. Because if you're like, go figure it out, or what do you think? That capacity to organize themselves and structure things is what they struggle with. So I think for parents who get frustrated with the child, they have to recognize that you're basically asking the child to do that thing that they don't know how to do. And you're putting them under even additional pressure to do it. And that's difficult. For kids with hyperactive impulsive subtype, we encourage physical activity, for instance, the sensory breaks in class, diet, good nutrition. You can't go wrong with that. Parents sometimes will say, my kid doesn't read dye. Again, we don't have data to support that, but parents will make the best decisions that they believe are in the best interest of their child. Regular sleep patterns is key because your brain needs some rest, and trying to have a time to wind down into sleep is also really, really important. For parents, create structured routines, as I mentioned, schedules, tell them when they're doing good, catch them early, catch them often, praise them, because then their self-concept becomes that they can succeed and they can do some things well, because everybody else calls them a troublemaker. Communicating them with them, clearly, consistently, concisely, and in very short bursts. So I wouldn't say go upstairs, tidy your room, brush your teeth, put your stuff away, and help me bring my bag. That kid is going to go upstairs and see their fan or their computer on the floor and want to pick up the computer and put it on the table. And as they're putting it on the table, they're like, wait a minute, I haven't even checked my email. And then they check their email. And then they'll be checking their email for the next 30 minutes. But if you tell the kid, go upstairs and make your bed, go upstairs and make your bed, they will go upstairs and all they hear is make your bed. So they'll make their bed. They might get distracted after they've made the bed, but then you have a responsibility to now go say, you've made your bed, go brush your teeth. So giving them short, clear instructions is more beneficial and more likely to be successful than saying, go and do multiple instructions. They don't do well with that. Break the tasks into smaller steps, limit the distractions, and talk to the teachers, engage with the school. That is so, so key. Knowing that there are parents of kids with ADHD in the audience, I know that there are parents in the audience with ADHD. So I think that these are the kinds of things that I think apply to everybody. Use a planner, sometimes you have a backpack with multiple compartments so you can put things where they're supposed to be so you don't have to look for them. Using a timer for activities, using alerts and alarms. Some people use color coding their belongings. These are things that you can use that many of my peers have used as they grew up, but they didn't realize that they were basically managing their ADHD. But it does look like they were really smart people. It looked like they were very capable people, but they were managing an underlying challenge. Now, technology, pros and cons. The good thing about technology is that we have it. We can use it. I'm here in Toronto, and you guys are all over the world and listening to me as though I was next door. So we celebrate technology and we embrace what it can do for us. There are many task management tools available on the internet, Todoist, Trello. You find the one that works for you and you use it, you test it out. If it works, great. If it doesn't, try something else. Google Calendar, Microsoft Outlook. I live on Microsoft Outlook. If it's not on my Outlook calendar, it's not happening, and it never happened. So it's good across the board, and especially when you have attention problems, it's important to have a place where you can go and say, what am I supposed to be doing now? There are some apps that gamify attention and focus. Forest is one. Headspace is another that helps with mindfulness exercises. These things are available on the internet. Google the term, you'll find it. I wouldn't worry too much about these tools, but find the one that works for you. Here's the risk, though. Many times we get too much attention. We're just paying attention to what's on the screen. Parents will say, well, he doesn't have ADHD when he's playing video games. Well, they want to play video games. They're interested in it. And I can't play a video game now to save my life because as far as I'm concerned, there's way too much happening on the screen. I have to look for that person who wants to kill me. I have to look for that gold thing I have to get. Then there's this person I'm supposed to save in the meantime. It's too much for me. But for people with ADHD, that is their comfort zone. They are accustomed to paying attention to multiple things at the same time. So they tend to thrive in that environment. And much to the parents' consternation, they're like, wait a minute, how come you sat there for 4 hours and you can't sit to do your homework for 10 minutes? That's the magic of video games. They know their audience when they're making these games. So having tools that you can use for parental controls and managing screen time. There are many apps. Again, find the one that works for you. I'm not promoting any tool here. I'm simply using this as examples. Future directions for research. We have to be able to do what we're trying to do here at Sick Kids, personalized medicine, so that the intervention is for you, not for most Black kids or most white kids or most Asian kids. It is for this individual because we looked at your DNA and this is the medicine that we believe would work best for you. A lot more neuroimaging studies are telling us more about what we know about ADHD. And based on that, interventions are being created to make sure that we can intervene effectively. I think the more we know, the better we can be. And so there are a number of innovative treatments, non-medication treatments. And I was at a conference earlier in the year where we have patches now. We have medications that don't start working till the morning. We can give them at night when the kid is awake, so that when they wake up in the morning, they are alert, because parents will tell you until the kid gets the medicine in their system, it's a nightmare. And so there are many creative things that are happening now in terms of the technology and research. And so just to my point earlier about how we can use how asking the right questions gives us better answers. I had done a search on ChatGPT. Most of you might be familiar with the language learning models. And I used DALL-E, which is an AI kind of system that allows you to use text, convert text to image. And I asked it a question. I was like, can you create an image of Nigerian children with ADHD in a classroom? And so that was my request for ChatGPT in collaboration with DALL-E, which is this AI system. And this is what it came up with. And so there were many things about this image that were near and dear to my heart, because I was like, yes, girls are represented. Yes, they're looking off into the abyss and just wondering about their future and what they're going to have for lunch. And the teacher is there probably trying to do some work, but nobody's paying attention. But I just felt, yeah, this is warm and near and dear to my heart, but this is not the classroom that I was in when I was in school. And so I refined my question and I said, can you adjust it to represent the full ADHD spectrum of presentations? And this is what it came up with. And I said, aha, these are the troublemakers in the class. And so for me, this was more representative of my impression of what ADHD looks like in a classroom. And so my point is, with the right questions, you get better answers. And so having said that, I want to thank you for your participation, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Akintan. This was a fantastic session. I believe we have Dr. Oshodi and Dr. Oshodi. I don't know if you want to say anything.
I just want to thank Dr. Akintan. Hello, Dr. Akintan. Thank you so much. And it was a very lovely presentation. You really broke down the concepts for us all and gave us several hints on little practical things that can be done for our kids with ADHD. I think it's commoner than we admit. That's what I'll just contribute to what you said. And the myth that no one has ADHD in Nigeria or in Jos, obviously you've debunked that, and I suspect that everyone on the call knows someone that has some ADHD symptoms, and rather than just think the young boy or the girl is just a dreamer, a bit lazy, we need to just ask ourselves, could this child be struggling? I think maybe that's an important take home from all you said, that we need to have a high index of suspicion and seek expert help. And thank you once again. This was a wonderful one. Well done.
My pleasure. I don't know if there are questions
so
specifically.
we would open it up for questions. I'm going to start out in the chat, and then you could feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I'll go through them. So from Nene Akintan, it says, how do we deal with this? How do we help them to express their intelligence?
I think one, by way of disclaimer, that's my wife, by the way. In terms of expressing their intelligence, they will have different places and different environments where they can express their intelligence. Our responsibility is to make sure that there are no impediments to it. And so that is diagnosing early, treating, and making sure that the burden of the symptoms is less. Because you're not going to tell a child how to be intelligent, right? You're not going to tell them what to do to be intelligent. They are intelligent. They can solve problems. What you want to do is remove the barrier. And so if the burden of the illness is the barrier, you want to treat the illness so that they can express themselves.
Okay, fantastic. There's another question which I actually put in there. It's does ADHD present with lack of speech, or is that more autism or some other disorder?
So earlier I talked about the comorbidity, that ADHD rarely happens by itself. And so the inability to speak would not be something that we would consider a cardinal symptom in ADHD. And if I see a kid with ADHD symptoms who also has difficulty with speech, I would look to other causes of the difficulty with speech, selective mutism, a number of different things that could contribute to the inability to speak, either in certain settings or just generally. But I wouldn't consider the inability to speak by itself a cardinal symptom that I would be looking for in ADHD.
Okay. So we have another question. I hope I can pronounce this right. Is guanfacine a good medication for ADHD?
Guanfacine. So guanfacine, so in the presentation, one of the slides was a slide with clonidine. Clonidine is, and you just have to forgive me, I'm going to get technical because I imagine that the person either is a technical person or a physician themselves. Guanfacine is an alpha agonist. It's very similar to clonidine in terms of how it works. So yes, it can be effective, but it also has the same effect size as clonidine. And so we use it for many people, either for symptoms of aggression or agitation. Some people say it makes them feel sleepy, but it's an effective medication, similar to clonidine. I am at work, so there's a hospital paging system from time to time.
Okay. Another question is, I'm not sure what you have the answer for this, but do we have a good supply of these medications available in Nigeria? Are there also psychologists or similar clinicians who are trained and delivering interventions and coaching in Nigeria?
So I think, I hope I have my dates right. I think it was 2014. I was in Nigeria and I gave a small talk. And I had the privilege of meeting this brilliant physician, Dr. Yinka Tilola, and we've been friends since. And he explained to me the landscape in Nigeria and the breadth of intellect that I've always known. I mean, I was trained there, so I knew that there were people way, way, way smarter than me there. And so I know that there are people who are providing that care. And like I mentioned, I met a number of brilliant psychiatrists who practice in Nigeria, who we met at the conference. And so, yes, there are people. I don't have specific names, but I suspect that people who are moderating this forum would know individuals who can help with treatment for ADHD, who are familiar with it, who probably treat it on a day-to-day basis. So I would defer to the experts in the room who are practicing in Nigeria.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Akinbode. Mrs. Fatoba, let me quickly attend to that.
Yeah.
So on the medications, yes, sometimes we have them readily available, sometimes they are scarce in the country. I would say that currently, we do not have Concerta from Janssen. Ritalin, sometimes we get some brands from India.
And then guanfacine, somebody got it a few weeks back. Guanfacine is available, but it's quite expensive. For a supply of 30 days, 1 milligram of guanfacine is about 280k. 1,000 naira. So when they're available, they're expensive. Many of the times we can't even access. I mean, they're not available in the country. And then on the psychologists, yes, we have some psychologists, specifically child psychologists. I may not be able to comment on that, but there are people who have worked with us, I mean, child and adolescent psychiatric services for a long time. But we are all faced with this issue of brain drain, not just psychologists, doctors, I mean, social workers, speech therapists, occupational therapists, and all of that. So it's a general problem, but medications, yes, some are available, especially in Lagos. They may not be available in the rural areas, but we sometimes get them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adigbite. Next question is, how can adults with ADHD best manage their symptoms in professional environments, especially trying to focus on detailed tasks?
Wow. I love that question because I get asked that question a lot. And I would, if we had some time, I would have shared an anecdote about a colleague of mine who can no longer practice medicine because for a day, they did not take their ADHD medicine and they engaged in an act that was career changing, career damaging. So it's a big deal. The stakes are high. So I feel the sentiment of the person who's asking the question, whether they're asking for themselves or asking for somebody else. I think that the primary thing is, one, identifying it, two, treating it. We have treatment for ADHD. And just to give, and again, I want to kind of respect what Dr. Adigbite said. It's probably expensive to get these medicines, but the medicines are effective. And again, the risk of not treating when you do have delicate tasks that you have to attend to is high. The risk is high. And so I think, yes, you can put a lot of structure around you. That's helpful. Yes, you can create some constraints so that the risk of you acting impulsively and putting other people at risk is less. You can do all of those things. And you can, again, as an adult, you can evaluate whether or not they're very effective and which is more effective than others. There are a number of things that you can do. But if you can afford it, I think that the medicines are quite effective. And for many people, life-changing, literally life-changing. So yes, that's what I would say. Once you know what's going on, try to get the treatment. And while you're doing that, try to get the resources around you in terms of scheduling, putting yourself, time constraints, those types of things that would aid your functioning.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I have not been expressly diagnosed with autism or ADHD, but I know that I might be somewhere on the spectrum. I've experienced maybe I'm not that smart moment when I see my grades for a course, but I am in a lot of work or a course, and I think I understand. I really feel discouraged to study. How do I come out of the loop of not wanting to study anymore?
It's heartbreaking. It is heartbreaking. And I hear that often. And I can't imagine what that must be like day in, day out, and carrying that burden through life. I think that again, the self-appraisal, the self-awareness that you've demonstrated is the first step. The next step would be what you can do to treat it. And by treating is, how do you reduce the burden? Because when you've seen yourself perform less than you have the capacity to, when you've seen yourself being surpassed by people that you have more capacity than, it's depressing. You don't want that. Nobody wants to live that way. So I would say, seek the help of a professional, have them come up with a treatment plan that makes sense. Given your budget that you have, given the resources that you have, there might be things that you can do in terms of your environment to create more structure. But I would say that for me, I can't promote medication treatment enough because I've seen it do really, really remarkable things for people. And this is simple to treat. But there are financial constraints, there are resource constraints in terms of access. So I recognize all of that. But I would say get access to one of the clinicians who are here on the forum, and perhaps they can share their contact with you. Perhaps they can come up with a treatment plan with you. I can't speak to the logistics of meeting a psychiatrist, but I can say that the self-awareness is the first and most important step. The next step is trying to do something about it, getting access to a care provider who can guide you.
Okay, thank you. Two more questions I'm seeing. Is risperidone appropriate for treating ADHD? Due to the lack of ADHD drugs in Nigeria and cost barriers, my son's neurologist prescribed risperidone, but it seemed to work for a bit, but then after 2 months, it wore off.
Yeah. So risperidone, for people who are not familiar with, is it's a neuroleptic medication. That's just a technical term. It's also called an antipsychotic medication, also like a mood stabilizer. So it can do a bunch of things. We use it to treat a bunch of things. We use it to treat bipolar disorder. We use it to treat schizophrenia or psychosis. We use it to treat aggression in young people, perhaps with autism, perhaps with ADHD, not because it treats ADHD, but because it's sedating. It's a calming medicine. So because we've talked about ADHD and what we think is going on in the brain of somebody that's got ADHD, the hyperactivity is one set of symptoms. So the risperidone can help with that, but they're still not paying attention. They're still not following directions. And so if their body becomes accustomed to the medicine, because don't forget, they don't have psychosis, they don't have bipolar disorder, and they may not be aggressive. And if they are, then it can perhaps attenuate that a little bit. But over time, the ADHD symptoms will come to the fore again, right? The challenge remains. And so although the risperidone seems to it's like the Tylenol for the headache, right? If you have a stroke and that's why you have a headache, yes, you can take a Tylenol. You might feel a little bit better. However, the thing that's underlying the headache is still there. So yes, it can be effective if the primary symptom is aggression and disruptive behavior, yes. But the core symptoms of ADHD persist, and those are the things that would, as a questioner has described, just kind of rear their head again.
Okay, thank you. I think we're running out of time, but I see just 2 more questions. I'm going to run through them quickly. There's one about vitamins. Are there vitamins that help with the brain function to address or improve attention deficits and possibly hyperactivity? Can risperidone help with ADHD? Okay, you've already answered the risperidone one.
So I'll start by saying I'm not an expert in complementary and alternative medicine, and that's that the vitamins, omega 3, ginkgo biloba. There's a whole industry of complementary and alternative medicines that is available. I would speak to the things that have evidence to support them. And right now, we don't have any evidence to support the use of vitamins in the treatment of ADHD. However, as I mentioned earlier, all of you as parents are the experts of your children. You all have your unique beliefs. You all have your unique practices. And as long as they are safe, you have the prerogative to do what you feel is in the best interest of your child, including giving them vitamins. So I would not prescribe vitamins to treat a child with ADHD, but I would not kind of judge a parent who believes that the use of vitamins in their child helps them to do better. So I think that's a judgment that a parent will have to make. It just would not be something that I would recommend as a treatment for ADHD.
Okay, thank you. Our last question for the evening is, as a parent, what strategies would you say help to manage the frustrations associated with parenting a teenager with classic ADHD symptoms? There's a tug of war between being sympathetic to their exceptionalities and limitations, yet needing to be firm and ensuring that they find their way to self-regulate and take responsibility.
Yeah, you're a good parent. You're a good parent. The fact that you articulated the question that way tells me that you're a good parent and you're doing the best you can. It is not easy. to parent a child with ADHD when you don't know that they have ADHD. And when you find out that they have ADHD, it becomes a struggle to try to figure out what you can do to best support them. And it's a significant burden on parents. So your journey is a journey that's probably familiar to many. And so it is very, very difficult to navigate those kind of things that you just articulated in terms of balancing. You want to you want to help them with self-regulation, you want to help them with order, you want to know that they have to go to school because they have to get an education. And then you're frustrated because you're having to say the same thing over and over and over again. So it's hard. It is super hard. And I don't think that there's any easy answers. If there was, I guarantee you would not have asked that question because you probably would have figured it out. It is hard. However, I think that in those situations where things are impossibly hard and I'm faced with impossibly hard situations, I try to do something professionally. I call it shared risk or shared responsibility. I find people who can resonate with me, who understand my experience, and perhaps there are strategies that they have used that I haven't. Perhaps there's opportunity for me to be like a beacon and help other people and say, here's how hard it is for me. Perhaps even in expressing my frustration and my challenges, I get some relief because I'm validated by people who have also experienced what I've experienced. So there isn't an easy answer to your question, except one, it is important that the child gets treated. Two, it is important that whatever within your capacity you have as resources, you make available to the child. But most importantly, you have also got to take care of your own mental health. You are the best parent for that child when you're the best person that you can be. So if you yourself struggle with anxiety or you yourself struggle with ADHD, you need to seek treatment for yourself, because when you're better treated, you're more effective as a parent. And many times I've seen that parents struggle because they are so focused on, I want the best for my kid, forgetting that they need to be there, the very best version of themselves for their kid.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akintan. We're running out of time, and I just want to pass it back to Dr. Adegbite to close us out. I think she's still in the room. Dr. Adegbite?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Handing over to you.
Yes. Okay, so Dr. Akintan, thank you so very much for this wonderful presentation about ADHD. I'm sure we have all learned one thing or the other, the parents, caregivers, professionals, and all of us. I mean, particularly myself, when I saw the last post, that last picture, that I saw some boys, I mean, distracted towards the window. I said, wow, that is, thank you so very much. Thank you everyone for your time. Dr. Oshodi, I don't know, she's in, maybe she also wants to say something. Hello, ma.
Just to say thank you. Thank you to everyone for joining us at the Center for Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disorders, who are organizers of this. And to let you know that we organize these kinds of webinars from time to time. And there will be a notice out for another one. And our partner, Bode, that you've met, they have this amazing app for assessing children that we suspect may be on the spectrum with autism spectrum disorders. So there's much more on the link that has been shared. You could take a look, and we'll be happy to have you at our next webinar. Just follow us on, as they say, follow us on LinkedIn, follow us on Instagram, can do, of the College of Medicine, University of Lagos. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Akintan, once again. Thank you.
A pleasure. Have a good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akintan. Thank you, everyone.